I thought there would be more, at least in chapter 1. I thought there would be more where I was like, oh, I misunderstood it the last time I did the reading guide. But I didn't find too much of that because Lenin writes so succinctly. And so concisely, and is able to bring out what's important really well. So yeah, the first, well, actually, I'm gonna skip the preface. I'm gonna go straight to the introduction, which says that with the Spanish-American War of 1898 and the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, which the Spanish-American War was the U.S. seizing a bunch of colonies in Latin America, and the Anglo-Boer War was the British Empire seizing a bunch of territories in southern Africa. Capitalism reached its imperialist stage, the latest stage of capitalist development. It reaches a new era called imperialism. And there are a lot of great analyses of imperialism from reformist Marxists and economists like Kautsky, and the English economist J.A. Hobson, who analyzed the principal political and economic features of capitalism, talk about what characterizes this era of imperialism. Sorry, I meant to say capitalist imperialism, not just capitalism that they talk about. So here you see Lenin drawing from reformists and even bourgeois right-wing pro-capitalist economists, just as we do today, because you can learn a lot of things even from people you disagree with, especially when you live under capitalism and there's going to be a bunch of bourgeois economists running around. So there's another good book by the Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hinferding called Finance Capital, which gives a good theoretical analysis, although Lenin says he's confused about the theory of money. Again, we see how this is based on the work of Marx and Marx's Capital. So most of Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is going to focus on economics rather than politics, although he says the political analysis is equally important. And that's sort of like what Vijay Prasad's Washington Bullets is. It's an economic analysis for sure. It involves economic analysis, but it's mostly about the development of the political systems that support the imperialist stage of capitalism over the last 100 years or so, since Lenin, actually. And then Lenin also mentions that pacifism is not what he's supporting here. Imperialism is not just violence, or violence by the government, violence by the state in the abstract, or violent foreign policy abstractly. Right? Imperialism is a stage of development of capitalism. It is capitalism in its monopoly stage, when the capitalists go abroad and use violence to expand their markets, use economic warfare, and attempt to control the political systems of other countries in order to carry out their economic interests or best serve their economic interests. So that's what Lenin's going to be talking about here, and that's the end of the introduction. And then it moves on to chapter 1, the concentration of production. So Lenin talks about this enormous growth of industry that's come about since Marx wrote Capital in 1867, since he died in 1883, and even in the last few years leading up to 1917. So Marx says that the concentration of production into increasingly larger enterprises is a characteristic feature of capitalism, that the firms which dominate capitalism, the manufacturing factories and the companies controlled by capitalists, are going to merge together and concentrate and form into large-scale industries, rather than smaller firms producing less commodities at a time. And with the Industrial Revolution, Marx really saw the explosion of large-scale industry, rather than smaller-scale artisans or manufacturers. So labor becomes more productive in the era of large-scale industry, and production becomes concentrated more intensely than workers become concentrated, which means there's more fixed capital, there's more machines, there's more factories rather than manual labor, which we'll discuss later. So Lenin goes over a bunch of statistics in the early 1900s that show how large-scale industry in Germany and the U.S. were coming to dominate production and employment. And, they also dominate energy usage. The vast majority of power in society, or that's utilized by society, is utilized by large-scale industry, by giant monopolies and huge concentrated companies, which now has a lot of implications for climate change, right? Because the economy is entirely dependent on fossil fuels. And because shareholders and syndicates, cartels, trusts, monopolies, investment groups like BlackRock and Vanguard completely control production and the use of energy, there's not much that the working masses who are affected by climate change can do about it. So the U.S. at this time, in the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s, is the fastest growing, the fastest concentrating economy. In 1904, there are 1,900 large-scale industries. And then 5 years later, in 1909, there's over 3,000. So the development of concentration in the early stages of capitalism leads to the development of monopoly later on, meaning the concentration of factories and labor into the cities. And like I said, the displacement of smaller artisans, handicraft workers, and manufacturers by giant large-scale factories is what lays the basis for monopoly. So those large-scale factories at first are still based on free competition in the market. But later they'll come to dominate the market. And those large-scale industries, like I said, are the material base of monopolies that form. So this is the dialectical transformation of competition into monopoly. So competition in the free market over time develops into its opposite, monopoly and the domination of markets. And Lenin says that this is one of the most important developments in the capitalist mode of production. So there are different successive production processes and different branches of industry that begin to be combined as monopolies and conglomerates are formed. So you have production processes that were previously performed successively that are now being performed under the supervision of one firm or one conglomerate who organize successive labor processes to happen all at once under their eye. So, for example, you have the smelting of iron, which at one point was its own industry, its own. There were capitalist firms who would just do the smelting of iron and then sell that iron to somebody who smelts it into steel. And then the person who smelts it into steel, or the large-scale industry factory that smelts it into steel, would give it to somebody who turns that steel into a product, which they then sell. But now, as these steel conglomerates and syndicates are forming, they combine the smelting of iron, the smelting of steel, and the crafting into steel products all within one building, or, if not within one building, within a handful of buildings that are all controlled by the same shareholders, all controlled by the same capitalists, who often also control the ports or the railroads or the roads and the trucks that transport these goods back and forth. So you see, as production is concentrated, the ownership of production is also concentrated at the top. So there's a bourgeois or pro-capitalist economist called Hans Gideon Heyman, who actually admits that Marx's theory of concentration is proved true by the coalition of coal and steel companies forming into syndicates or conglomerates and closely allying with one another, and both being financed by the big banks. So we also have the role of banks, the role of finance capital here in supporting these conglomerates and helping them merger together. But the next chapter is the one that's going to focus on banks more heavily. So we'll get more into that later. But like I said, these conglomerates and trusts who are controlling the production of raw materials and the processes that turn those raw materials into products and sell them also are coming to control the means of transportation, rail and ports, and the means of production used to transport their goods, as well as those used to produce their goods. And they're also the production of raw materials and the manufacturing of goods are coming to be controlled by, the same conglomerates. So there are some people already in Lenin's day who are arguing the argument that's more common today, that it's not capitalism that leads to imperialism, right? Because capitalism is characterized by free competition. It's actually crony capitalism or government intervention. And real capitalism would be capitalism based on free competition. And this has never been true. Free competition, like we said, is a fundamental principle of capitalism, but over time it develops into its opposite, monopoly. So capitalism itself is destined to become monopoly. So Lenin shows how monopoly was accelerated by state intervention in Germany, but it also happened in the English economy, which was more based on free trade and free markets. So regardless of the state intervening, free competition develops into monopoly. Sometimes the monopolies or the large scale industry capitalists or the corporations come to control the government, though, and use the government to accelerate their concentration. So that just accelerates the process. So as monopolies and cartels and syndicates and combines, trusts form, the barrier to entry in the market increases. So other companies or other capitalists who want to get involved in a market need to pay, or the entry to that market, the cost of the productive capital needed to produce goods for that market increases with the formation of these combines. Because in order to compete with them, you have to produce just an insane quantity of goods because they're based on large scale industry. They can produce so much at once and they're financed by the banks that it becomes really, really hard to compete with them in this market or even enter the market. So Lenin says that Marx predicted concentration and monopoly, which economists in his day are now accepting. But a lot of those same economists say Marxism is refuted despite accepting his theory of concentration. And they do this with a lot of his breakthroughs, just accepting them, but never crediting him. And Lenin calls this a conspiracy of silence. And we still see this today, where people acknowledge the theories of Marx have been proven correct, or, the core of the theories. And they accept them, but they don't give Marx credit, or sometimes they'll even slap a new name on something that Marx realized 200 years ago, and try and make it into a theory of their own. That's kind of the nature of the academy. You're always going to have stuff like that, the capitalist academy. And Lenin says, these economists can try and discredit Marx through a conspiracy of silence, but facts are a stubborn thing and they have to be reckoned with whether we like it or not. So Lenin is basically saying facts don't care about your feelings there. And he cites Ben Shapiro, of course. Just kidding. But free trade was taken as a given by the economists in Marx's day. At the time, there were only an isolated few monopolies, but they began to develop more and more with boom-bust cycles and with technology. So, of course, capitalism is prone to crises. And after an economic crash, after an economic crisis, there's a mass investment of capital and flooding of capital to the market. So these boom cycles are times when concentration greatly increases and cartels, syndicates, and monopolies are able to form. Another characteristic of monopolization is that it allows companies to drive prices higher, higher than the value of labor as measured in labor time. And Paul Cockshott talks about this some when he's discussing the correlation between labor time and price. Monopolization and concentration seizes more and more industries with time, and eventually free competition is systematically removed. And this happens at really the beginning of the 20th century, or the end of the 19th century. That's when capitalism qualitatively changes and reaches its imperialist monopoly stage, leaving behind the free competition stage. And Lenin breaks down the development of monopoly capitalism and imperialism into a handful of stages, beginning between 1860 and 1870. Like when I said, Marx published Capital in 1867. So Marx is looking at this stage of free competition. But after 1867, monopolies start to develop. There's only a few of them and they're isolated and they don't control the economy by 1870, but there are a few of them. And large-scale industry has developed. The basis for what would later become monopoly capitalism had already developed. So monopoly capitalism, imperialism was in its embryonic stage, its very earliest developments. There's then an economic crisis in 1873. We see the development of a lot more cartels. Now, a lot of these don't last. A lot of them aren't very durable. They're transitory, but we do see the development of more and more of them, and we see increasing concentration and monopolization during times of crisis. So at the end of the 19th century, 1890, and onward, and at the very beginning of the 20th century, we see cartels become the foundation of economic life. There's a lot of crises at the end of the 19th century that allow for this to happen. And we see the rise of monopolies backed by the big banks really take over at the turn of the century. And it becomes, like I said, the basis of economic life. Most markets and industries are now dominated by cartels and monopolies. Capitalism has qualitatively transformed into imperialism, a new stage out of the stage of free competition. And at this time, Standard Oil is founded in the U.S. In 1900, the beginning of the 20th century. I feel like that's pretty symbolic. We always learn about, the giant steel and oil monopolies in the early 1900s in history class. And this is when Lenin's saying is exactly when capitalism qualitatively transformed into its stage of imperialism. So the magnitude of output and technology makes these cartels like Standard Oil dominant over competition, and just allows them to grow bigger and bigger. They pay out huge dividends to their shareholders, just as they do today. And this comes with the transition away from manual labor and towards more machine labor. Like I said, the productivity of labor increases. So machines allow a lot more to be produced with a lot less labor. So the concentration of these monopolies comes with concentration of machine labor and less manual labor. Humans are essentially just cogs that keep the machine processes going. So we also see at this time the intellectual property regime begins. Companies, monopolies, cartels, and banks start buying up patents so that they can stop competitors from producing products that will compete with their own. Strategic patent buyouts begin to happen. Of course, you can only do this if you're one of the richest companies, if you're one of the dominant ones. This is still how it works today. I was talking to one of my engineering buddies this weekend a lot about what he does at work. And a fair amount of what he does is just reading through patents, understanding patents, and trying to work around patents in order to make things that are useful. And it just seems like a huge hassle. It's hugely inconvenient to the development of production and the advancement of production and human technology, because he constantly has to work around these patents that are owned by other companies, owned by other engineering companies, if he wants to make something cool and new with a new function or an improved function. So if there's like a circular nut, he'll have to make his nut like a triangle, even if it's inconvenient to do so because some other company owns the patent on the circular nut. It sounded really frustrating, but it's interesting that Lenin is talking about this in 1917. It's still the case of today. So Lenin also looks at the concentration of German chemical companies like Bayer and Hoechst. I don't know. My German's not very good, y'all. But these are what I talk about in the Journal of American Socialist Studies 2, which you can get at midwesternmarx.com in the book section on ebook or paperback. You can see it up there on the bookshelf, right there, the black journal at the top. I talk about the development of the pharmaceutical industry and the development of for-profit capitalist healthcare, and what the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical monopolies actually develop out of is these German chemical companies, Bayer and Hoechst being Hoechst, Hochst is how you pronounce that. And there's a little mark, a little grammar mark that I don't know what it is above the O. Clearly my German is really good. Either way, these German chemical companies develop into these giant pharmaceutical companies that dominate the industry. And, in modern day, in the last 20 years, created the opioid crisis by controlling academic institutions, controlling the media, controlling political NGOs, and using that to push opioids on people and attack anybody who criticized the the expansion of opioid prescriptions to make a profit as being opiophobic, literally. So we also see the concentration of production in the modern day of intellectual production, of the production of information. Media and academic institutions that produce the information people consume are also controlled by these large monopolies and trusts. And in the case of the German chemical companies, the same trust that Lenin is watching concentrate in 1917, which forms the basis for later monopolies. And nowadays, these trusts are also tied together by investment groups. You have like Vanguard and BlackRock, which are just coalitions of shareholders, super wealthy shareholders that are paid dividends through these investment groups. And it allows them to remain more anonymous and just more easily divide up the booty and divide up markets between the largest capitalists in the country, or on London and Wall Street at least. So at this time, there's increased collaboration at this time, meaning in Lenin's time, there's increased collaboration between monopolized companies who divide the market between themselves, as we were just talking about, and there are new methods of doing this today, like the investment groups. Production becomes increasingly cooperative, concentrated, and therefore social, but appropriation remains private. So we said that large-scale industry and the concentration of production itself is the basis, the material basis that allows monopolies to grow. So you see the concentration of production, the move of production towards cooperation and large-scale industry in these factories, which produces an insane amount of wealth, but all that wealth is appropriated by capitalists at the top, by the shareholders who control these cartels. So production becomes social, but ownership and appropriation of the products or of the value created in production remains private. And social production remains the private property of extremely wealthy individuals. So at this point, you see a move away from commercial activity and towards speculative activity, like Wall Street speculators that I'm sure we've all heard of. People who buy up stock that they think is going to grow and profit over the next few years in the future. And then they sell that stock when it's high, sell that stock when it's more valuable, and try and make money that way. And this becomes the most successful capitalists are now Wall Street speculators, people who are good at predicting how the economy is going to move and buying and selling stocks, rather than people who are able to produce a product or an innovation that others find valuable, or that allows them to produce more than competitors in the market. Capitalism in its monopoly stage, in its imperialist stage, rewards technological innovation less and less, and comes to reward speculation and the manipulation of stocks and shares a lot more. And of course, we've seen that today. The US has basically become entirely financialized. All of the country's wealth and ownership of the means of production has been concentrated into the hands of an incredibly small amount of capitalists, of Wall Street shareholders, and some shareholders in London and the UK, like I said, who just control everything from agriculture to the service industry, regular industry. They're connected to the banks. So these are all speculators. People who are really good at gaming the stock market in order to increase their own wealth. The companies that are able to monopolize the fastest, or the industries that monopolize the fastest, are those which capture raw materials first, the production of raw materials first. So say if I'm a capitalist, or, and I own a large scale industry factory that produces steel products, manufactured steel products. And then I come to control a steel mine, in the area just 5 miles away. I'm going to be able to develop into a monopoly very fast. The production of raw materials, the extractive industries, the production of coal, oil, and other energy sources by capitalists involved in industry and connected to the banks is what allows monopolization to happen very quickly. And this happens faster in some industries rather than others. In industries where the nature of production in that industry makes it easier for the capitalists to capture the sources of raw materials. It can get a little complex, but it's actually not that complicated if you just think about it. Back then, there were bourgeois economists saying that cartels and monopolies could abolish crises. Obviously, this was wrong. Monopolies actually make crises worse and more frequent a lot of the times. And remember that with crises, with the boom bust cycles, concentration increases. The concentration of capital does. So crises create concentration. Concentration creates crises, and they increase and lead to each other. Um, so yeah, that's the end of chapter 1, the concentration of production. Next time we're going to go on to chapter 2, which is the new role of the banks. So like I said, as industry is growing and concentration is increasing, all these cartels and syndicates and monopolies that are forming are also being backed by the banks. They're being financed by the banks. That leads to a huge acceleration of concentration and monopolization. So the banks are very important. And Lenin says at the end of chapter 1, we can't have a full understanding of the growth of monopolies, of the transition of capitalism from its free competition stage into its imperialist stage, that qualitative transformation, unless we understand the role of the banks in facilitating the easier investment of capital, and the role of the banks in financing the growth, development, and concentration of industry. It's not just the industrial capitalists, it's the merger of the industrial capitalists with the finance capitalists, with the bankers, that leads capitalism to transform to its imperialist stage. So that's what we'll talk about next time. But I hope you enjoyed chapter 1. This is one of my favorite books. It is my favorite book, actually. I think I've said that before a handful of times. So I'm glad to cover it again. I'm glad to rerun over this reading guide that I did so long ago, in better quality, hopefully, and with a lot more knowledge in my noggin. So yeah, I hope y'all are looking forward to chapter 2, the new role of the banks.